record to the cloud. This is, and these are the folks at home. Let me minimize that too. And I want to talk to you first about quiz 3. And these are cut and paste. This is the question. Identify the image by subject matter, size, media, date, and place of creation. Now, there's a couple of things that are not, that I did not ask for quite deliberately. First is a title, because we don't do titles on ancient works. That's kind of a new thing. So we basically title it with the subject matter. So we have, for instance, King Ashurbanipal. We know who he is. This is his sculpture. And let me see who else came in here. Like Dylan, I think, yeah, Dylan, okay. So I didn't ask for a title, and I did not ask for an artist. That's another new concept, relatively new concept. In the day, a lot of this artwork is made, not all of it. We saw some artists that we could identify in ancient Greece and in Rome, but for the most part, you would not know the creator of the work. And there's a couple of reasons for that. And part of it, as I'd explained previously, we know who the architect is for this building. Well, I don't know, but you can look that up, and that person will get all of the credit. And maybe if you dug in a little deeper, you could find a construction company that actually built the building. But you won't, it's going to be like real hard to find. Who put the whiteboard up here? Who painted the walls? Who put this drop ceiling in here, by the way, and installed the projector? You don't know those things, and it's not considered like that important to know who they are. And that was kind of the fate of artists back in the day. That's one explanation. Second explanation is that in certain cultures, and a lot of ancient cultures, but still persist today, the artist usually or typically recreates work that had been done previously. Whoa, what a concept. Let me give you an example, because we're going to look at Chinese art. And I had a friend that studied art in this way, so I got this directly from China and my friend Xi Ping. Bottom line, when you study art, you study calligraphy in China, what you try to do is emulate the old masters, and how good you are is how well you can copy what the old masters did. And this idea of originality, that's kind of a new idea too. Of course, that kind of becomes an issue, say, in Greece and Rome, but the idea of originality is not particularly, it's not treasured. It's not even expected. And so how well you reproduce, in this case, the iconic image of the Virgin Mary, Saint Theodore, Saint George, the angels, and the infant Jesus. How well you do that, following the standards, following all of the stuff that came before. It's copying, and the idea of originality is really discouraged. We don't want people going off on their own, doing different kinds of things. And so anyway, that's why I wrote this question the way I did. And for the most part, you guys got that, because bottom line, you could just copy that right out of here. That's everything I'm asking. Here's where I want to really dig in. Describe the elements of the iconography and what they represent. Support your answer with information gathered from the internet and textbook. And so if you gave me, well, this is St. Theodore, that's St. George, of course, that's who they are. But what are the things that make this St. Theodore? What makes this St. George? What makes this the Christ child? You can't really get into this too awful much, but you zoom in, you can see that this had actually had a cross. But there are other things that make this what it is, and that's really what I wanted you to dig into. Some of you did, some of you apparently didn't really understand what I was asking for. And so how do we know this is St. Theodore and St. George? Well, we have a couple of things. First, we see the crosses, and somebody actually wrote that there's a lot of crosses in here, so we know that's true. And the idea of a halo means, and I've gotten a little bit of variation on that, but that it doesn't mean that they're a saint, but it does mean they're holy. And so, yeah, some of the angels are saints, but mostly we only recognize the archangels like Michael and Gabriel and so on. But these are not distinctive. They're not archangels, but we know this is Christ. And there's a couple of things going on here too. One, if you can see that, he's got that scroll in his hand. And the idea of having a scroll in his hand means that he was, well, that he was prophesied, that the ancient prophets actually wrote that God would send a Messiah. And yeah, smart too, because that's kind of part of the, I'm glad you brought that up, Betty, because that's part of what's going on here, is that many people in this day and age were illiterate. So you had to communicate with visual elements. And so we see these guys have swords, and we typically believe that St. Theodore was older. St. George, some of you gave me some good information about St. George going on to be the patron saint of England. And some of you even talked about how these soldier saints would become important later, especially during the Crusades. The idea of fighting for Christ becomes kind of a part of the Christian doctrine. But at any rate, and there's some other things going on here too. And some of you talked about this, that she and Mary and Jesus are elevated, which is true. But this is actually a throne. You can see the sides of it here.
Oh, I actually missed that.
What?
That's kind of hard to notice, actually.
Well, I know that's why I was asking you to do some research on it too. But yeah, it is hard to know. Part of why I picked this one is that this becomes sort of the prototype for the images of Christ and Mary, which is called the Madonna, becomes the image that'll withstand, it'll stand the test of time. We'll still see these elements as denoting, as I said here, representing the Christ and Mother. And so let me go through some of these things. Some of this I picked out of your paper, some of it I just added. But these are all things that support this image. And it says the Britannica defines iconography as the science of visual art interpretation, classification, description, symbols, and themes of subject matter. And I thought, wow, that's true. I'm going to put this on the PowerPoint because that's exactly why I asked you to give a description, the symbols and themes of subject matter. Because as I said a moment ago, a lot of people were illiterate, so you had to communicate the message through symbols and here, iconography. And so that's why it became standard. You know, you couldn't really have this as a Madonna, like we saw, and then somebody else dressed in pink. Say, it's not Madonna. Madonna has to be dressed in blue. That's another element of this iconography that, again, stands the test of time. It is adopted, and we'll see this for thousands of years, even today. When you go into a Catholic church, and you'll get different kinds of blue. Sometimes she's dressed in a sky blue or a powder blue or a dark navy or something, but blue as the color that denotes the Virgin Mary. And so I had talked about this little aspect of this in class, and nobody really wrote about it, but that's okay. The hairline, the idea of Christ, they had some issues about would he ever be an infant, because he was here to save humankind, right? And he was all-knowing. As Eddie said, he's smart. He's a baby, but he's got a scroll in his hand. He can read this, you know. Christ knows everything. So how do you portray this as a baby and somebody who is all-knowing? And so, like I said in class the other day, he's got a face like an adult. He's got a receding hairline. They couldn't quite give him a beard, but it is wisdom. It's what we're talking about. So here's one that I pulled out of one of the papers. I thought this was pretty cool. The saints are slightly lifted off the ground, and it is thought that this is their only mark of divinity. Well, I'm not sure I would agree with that. Their divinity is probably as much indicated by the halo. It's not the sole mark of divinity, but it is something that defines them as being divine. The Virgin is sat in the center. They are seated in a throne and elevated to be, quote, removed from our world. The Virgin is also highlighted by heaven's light to be, quote, connected to God. The spell angels are dressed in all white and have slightly transparent halos. Both these characteristics make their holiness more tangible, and that's another thing that we'll see. The white represents purity. The angels are pure. That's what's going on here. That's what I'm talking about. Now, let me see. The elements of the iconography represent the hierarchy of bodies. It goes from the saints to the Virgin to Christ to the angels. Angles, angels. A lot of people misspell that. It must be spell check. I don't know. And to God. The positioning of these bodies represents the path of holiness between God and humans. And so that is part of the Christian faith, at least as it was seen then. And that was that if you want to go to heaven, you have to go through Christ. And Mary, his mother, as sort of an intermediary between that. And this is the straight up path to God. What is important about what that quote says is that there is a hierarchy based on the placement of the images. And if you would do a line here to there and to there, you would see that Christ's head, more specifically, is right dead center on this. That's symbolic. That's what you do. And what we'll see later on is that we'll go more iconic and start making paintings and pictures based on theological size. So the relative importance in the faith is determined by the scale. But in this case, it's all pretty much the same scale. But anyway, heaven's light connected to God. And that's really what this is. And this is the hand of God the Father. And this is the light shining down. And that idea of a straight path from here all the way up to heaven. That's remarkably true. Let's see, in Christian art, Saint Theodore is often depicted with fellow dragon slayer Saint George, although the portrayals of Saint Theodore slaying a dragon predate those of his more famous companion, which is true. That's why you give Theodore the beard, because he's the older of the two. There's a symbolic point to that, and it says, among the military saints, Theodore and George were predominantly associated with the miracle of dragon slaying. And that's true. They both slay dragons. And they often appear together. In the hagiographical tradition, Saint Theodore clearly preceded Saint George in the role of dragon slayer. And so here's a little bit more about the history of Saint Theodore. And he refused to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods. And in fact, both of these saints were Roman soldiers converted to Christianity, which kind of gives them another layer of status in the church. And so he wouldn't offer sacrifices, and the governor asked why he would profess a faith in an outlawed religion, the worship of which was a capital offense, as we talked about with the Colosseum and so on. He responded, I know not your gods. Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, is my God. And so anyway, here's how he died. Eventually, he was condemned to death and burned alive in a furnace. And so one of the things that you might be getting from this too is the veneration of the martyrs of the Christian faith. This becomes a big deal in Christianity. And here's St. George was a member of the Cappadocian, Greek origin, and he was of the Praetorian Guard, which was kind of like the elite soldiers that guarded the emperor. The Praetorian Guard was like Delta Force or something. At any rate, for the Roman Emperor Diocletian, who was sentenced to his death for refusing to recant his Christian faith. He became one of the most venerated saints and the megalo martyrs in Christianity, and has been especially venerated as a military saint in the Crusades. And that's what I was mentioning a while ago. It was important during the Crusades. You guys know what I'm talking about with the Crusades?
During 1100, right?
Yes, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, in that time frame. And it's a time frame where Europe is reorganizing. I've been talking about the Dark Ages, the medieval days, and how things were chaotic, to say the least. Well, by the end of the first millennium, Europe was reorganizing, and one of the things that they thought they wanted to do was to recapture the Holy Land, which was basically occupied and ruled by Muslims. And so they wanted to go back and reclaim the Holy Land. It was kind of a fiasco. And there's a lot written about that, and in part because I think modern day scholars look at that and say, how can you go to war for Christ, who's known as the Prince of Peace? Going to war for Christianity seemed to be a contradiction, seemed to be a holy war, seemed to be oxymoronic, if you will. But at any rate, having these guys, Theodore and St. George, kind of gave them a path to make sense out of that. And England was big on the Crusades, by the way, England and France. And that's partly why St. George is the patron saint of England. And it says he is respected by Christians, Druze, as well as Muslims, as a martyr of monotheistic faith. I mean, kind of pull this apart a little bit too. There's a lot being said here. Anyone know who the Druze are? Okay. Well, here's who they are. They're what they call an ethno religious group. It's a faith. And sometimes we say they're ethno religious because at the same time their religion and their ethnicity are kind of tied together. They're from Western Asia, and predominantly in the countries of Lebanon and Syria, but there are Druze in other places in Southern Europe and so on. And the Druze are they believe in Christianity, but they also incorporate in their faith ancient Greek scholars and other kinds of philosophy, other kinds of religious practices, and so and some Muslims, and that is something that really have to emphasize when we talk about the Muslim faith, is that it's monotheistic. That's kind of the thing that goes from Judaism through Christianity through Islam, monotheism, because that separates this faith from what we were talking about with Rome and Greece, where they had polytheistic notions. And so anyway, Eastern icons have always had the Mother of God, that's Mary, in a blue dress with a red mantle. This is the Christ and Greek icons, which she holds the Christ child. Her station at the crucifixion and even on her bed at dormition. And so this last part is different stages of Mary's life, and the crucifixions, when they obviously crucified Christ, she was there and she was wearing blue. And dormition, that's when she died. And so anyway, meaning of Madonna and Child specifically symbolizes the motherly love of the Virgin Mary for Jesus, to see them enthroned, as is regularly found within these paintings. And that's talking about the Madonna and Child enthroned over a long period of time, is a reference to the critical importance of the Christian faith, with most compositions rising them up off the floor. Whoa, we were just talking. It's part of the iconography. And so this is really talking about Giotto, who was a pre-Renaissance Italian master. And so anyway, these are all things, we're talking about the iconography of the angel. Let me run back up here. Angels, when we're talking about the halos, they look up, they work for God, they're dressed in white. That's all part of the iconography. And so, and they have wings. And the wings that angels have sometimes feature when appearing to human beings, serve as symbols of God's power and loving care. This, again, this is what the iconography means. That's what I was talking about, pulling it apart and looking at the picture and reading it. And this goes back to Psalm 91:4. He will cover you with feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart. And so, verse 11, you see, this goes back to King David, the idea of angels. And so, that is what I was talking about with this second part. Third part, would you characterize this work as ideal, naturalistic, symbolic, parentheses, iconic, and why? And most of you, I had the numbers right here. Most of you, let's see, 10 of you had symbolic, 3 of you had ideal, 4 of you had iconic, and another person had kind of, I think it's symbolic and iconic, so, you know. But at any rate, I don't think this is particularly naturalistic. And why I say that is that if you saw these people, they would look like cartoons, you know, more or less. And that is why. Now, I didn't really dig into that. I wanted to see how you guys interpreted it. And I think that this is symbolic. These are all symbols of these figures in Christian religion. George, Theodore, Mary, Jesus, angels, God the Father. And so anyway, some of you guys gave me some other things about this that I thought was kind of cool. One person described what encaustic meant, which I was kind of happy to see. I don't really have to do anything with that, but it's painting, it's pigment inside of wax. It's wax paint. And so that was really pretty cool to see that. And a few other things that kind of came up. Theotokos. Some of you got into that word, and it's a Greek word that means bearer of God. Theo, that means God. Tokos, carrier of, and so that's pretty much explain. I think that if you think about theism, I was just talking about polytheism and monotheism. Theism is a belief in God. And so that Theo comes here. And Theodore is a name off of that lover of God, Theodoros. So anyway, that's my recap. Do you guys got any questions about that? Finally, one last thing, still had some people not putting their sources down. And I want to encourage you to do that. Carter.
I put my sources down as in notes, but like,
Yeah.
I tried to do, like, when I put the end note in, I would try to put the same source in 2 different spots in the paragraph, but it just wouldn't let me.
Oh,
It had
really?
it like the first source as like, it had the book source of number 1 and number 2, so it's like, I don't know why that happened.
Oh,
I
Yeah.
don't know if I should have put it as a footnote.
well,
instead.
I'm gonna go back and look at that. Basically, you can have. Yeah. Let me take a look at it. And see how we can clear that up, but you cited it, and that's good. And sometimes it's easier to do a parenthetic citation in the text that lists the author's name, and then just let the endnotes alone. I'll take a look at it.
Okay,
Yeah. And so. Let me make sure we're sharing. Yes, we are. And so we talked about this stuff and the knot pattern that we believe originated in Scandinavia. And they would call this, actually in Irish art, they call that a Celtic knot, by the way. But we see that plays in over and over again. And we talk about the Vikings, the stave church, and the Book of Darrow, 660 to 860. We're still right in the middle of what we thought was the Dark Ages. If you take a look at Sutton Hoo, it's roughly about that same time, 625, 660. And so, as I was describing life in Europe in late medieval times, the monasteries were the repository, they were the sanctuary of knowledge. They were the places that recorded the history, that actually preserved written language. They made Bibles. They did everything that was done in terms of publishing. That's how it happened. And so this is tempera on parchment, and this is St. Matthew. And one of the things about this time is that they're kind of doing this in essence on their own. They're really pretty isolated from a lot of things going on. And you see in the Byzantine Empire, that's what we were talking about with Madonna and George and Theodore. That's that was Byzantine. That's a Byzantine Madonna. But these guys aren't really getting, as you would say, they don't get the memo. They're kind of left to create their own iconography. That will change in due course, but right now, they're drawing from what they know, and this is Saint Matthew, one of the writers of the four Gospels, and check this out. Oh, we're seeing that Celtic knot pattern all around Saint Matthew. And so this is on parchment. It's meant to last a long time. It is, as it says here, the book of Duro. I was going to tell you this. Verso. That means the left page. And you can see the right page over here, and that's recto, just say. Verso recto. But at any rate, you can see they're almost reinventing how to portray Saint Matthew. They got his feet kind of going sideways. It's flat, patterns and decorations. It's the whole iconography is different. They're making it up. And cross inscribed Harpic from the Lindisfarne Gospels, and this is still roughly the same time. And here's the cross, and check out this pattern. This is not really unlike what we were seeing with this. And so the book arts, and they reference heavily the influence of Scandinavian, of Viking culture. This is a book of Kells, and this is really kind of the most famous of those medieval texts from Great Britain. And here it is. We got the book of Kells. Yes.
That was based on it.
It does. Yes, and this is Chi Rho Iota XPI. And I'm not exactly sure of this. I gotta go back and take a look at this, but I do think this is Saint Peter, but I'm not exactly sure. And I think that's why this sort of looks like a P. But at any rate, you can see here again, what I like to talk about is this patterning. It's not like woven pattern that is Scandinavian. Here's some more of the Lindisfarne Gospels. And so Saint Matthew, here he is again. And this quite possibly could be Saint Matthew as well. And they always like to identify the writers of the Gospels. They like to illustrate that. And what these would be called, as an artistic term, they would call these illustrated manuscripts. And that is, you get a picture that tells you part of the story, in this case, the gospel according to Saint Matthew. We got the angel. Why do we know it as an angel? We just been through that because it's got wings, got a halo. We know this is, and not exactly sure what this is, but my best guess is that this is a prophet. You see, he's old, wise, he's got a book, and the idea that Jesus was prophesied in the Old Testament is this recurring theme that goes through Christianity at that time. And this is from Spain, and this is, I think, kind of an interesting illustration because it's got it's the way it's stacked up, the way it's put together. This almost looks like it's from China or Japan, with the way that they had put their compositions together, and they'd use these devices of having like cutaways where you could see what's going on inside the house. The other thing I would point to here, because this is when Spain was predominantly Muslim, we got this Islamic architecture going on here with those exaggerated arches, like we saw in the mosque temple at Cordoba. From Germany, again, like I say, in Europe, they didn't get the memo about how you're supposed to portray Christ. They would have known he's supposed to have a beard, because they had established that in the Byzantine Empire and the Byzantine Church, but still has all of the other iconography going on here. The book, he was prophesied in the Old Testament. Oh, what's this going on here? That's the blessing. He's forgiving our sins. And again, just like Mary, enthroned. And with a little bit of this work here, the Celtic knot pattern. St. Matthew, this is another one from Germany. Again, you see a wildly different depictions. This is St. Matthew. That's St. Matthew. If you were to look at him, you wouldn't know that was the same person. And I got another St. Matthew here too. There we go, from the Igbo Gospels. Again, another depiction. So, what's the point? The point is, I hope you can see why it was important for the Byzantine Church to establish iconography, so that when you look at this, just because this guy is writing, and so is this guy writing, that doesn't mean anything. This could have been Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and it could have been anybody else, as far as that goes. And so anyway, that's why you do iconography, because it's visual language. People, by and large, can't read. And so anyway, one of the things that I thought, I'm glad they put this in there, the Utrecht Psalter, which is a prayer book. The drawings on here are just exquisite. These, you know, they may not have the iconography down, but they really do have the drawing skills. And so, and here is a schematic plan for a monastery. And mostly what this is, it just shows you that this is, the monastery was the place where it was not just religion that was kept alive, but it was still the science, the math, the engineering, the knowledge of the culture that was in decline in the world around them. And so another exquisite drawing from the Utrecht Psalter, and again, 820, 835. And in this case, it is representing Psalm 44. Anyway. We got some things down. We got angels down, angels with a halo, and this. When we start to see some of this arise in just before Christianity was legalized, then we see Christian iconography move away from this, and that is the crucifixion. once Constantine got on the throne and they had the consulate in Nicaea, and they really started to develop the iconography and develop the Bible itself, throwing out gospels as illegitimate, some as legitimate, things that they settled on, things that would come from ancient Jewish writing to be included in the Old Testament, some things not. And so anyway, but one of the things that they got rid of in short order was the depiction of Christ. And in part because they had some kind of, I thought it, how should I say this, largely distasteful. And so you can see this is what they made. This is the artwork that lasted all this time. We're not seeing a whole lot of other stuff. Except for manuscript illustration. Jesus washing the feet of Saint Peter. Otto III, in the Gospel book of Otto III. And see, now we're getting up to the year 1000. And roughly that's kind of a turning point. That's a turning point from the Middle Ages to the Romanesque era. And so we got some bits of sculpture, equestrian portrait of Charlemagne or Charles the Bald. We don't really know which. It's 9.5 inches high. So it's not one of these large scale sculptures. It's really kind of a small thing. I showed you this, counting this in sculpture, South Cross, a Celtic cross, another high cross of Meriadoc, East Base, Ireland. And again, they're taking some of the elements from ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Mesopotamia, the idea of having friezes here to tell stories. And the architecture itself was pretty simple in those days. And you can see in a lot of ways pretty severe. Bottom line is if they built a church and you had Vikings running around and all the other bands of enemies, you better have a church that could withstand an assault. So Palatine Chapel, here we go. Germany, check this out. Those archways, this looks like it's come right out of Islamic architecture. Of course, they're looking, they're trying to do what they can. Roman archway, stained glass. We'll talk more about that later. Town hall, Tor Hall, Germany, Abbey of Saint Ricoeur in France. And so this is like really kind of a good example of what I've been talking about all this time. Monasteries in a place where they could be defended. You see, it's like a fortress because they would have to fend off enemies. People would come in, they would invade, they would take everything that wasn't nailed down and kill all of the people, et cetera, et cetera. But you see, this is a church, but it's also a fortress. And we start to see the beginnings of what will end up being Romanesque and Gothic architecture. 12th century asp. See, this part's added on, but the inside, again, pretty much like what we were seeing in other parts. And there are the floor plans, and this is going to change again. Look at that archway, that brickwork. semi-Islamic architecture. And it looks quite a bit like the mosque cathedral at Cordoba. And again, these are the doors commissioned in 1015. Again, the idea of portraying scenes in friezes. And we just read this all the way up, and there's the crucifixion. But they're borrowing. That's the big point. They are borrowing from antiquity. This is a column with reliefs illustrating the life of Christ. Again, this is modeled after Trajan's column and some of the other columns from ancient Rome and ancient Mesopotamia. Again, they're using what they know. And again, Islamic architecture, the Islamic world had the engineers. They were way ahead. Europe was pulling itself up by the proverbial bootstraps. Adam and Eve. Otto the first presenting Magdeburg Cathedral to Christ. I showed you Otto the third. This is Otto the first. What we have here is this kind of struggle. They're trying to find out who is the boss, the church or the emperor, the soldier, the king, the statesman, or the pope. They're going back and forth. And so they're trying to, at least in this part, trying to reconcile that problem. And so you can see it's this ivory. And it's not that big, but the idea, we saw this in Justinian's time, the Emperor Justinian versus Jesus. And we see Justinian on the ceiling, on the walls of the church of San Vitale in Ravenna, Italy. And so we're trying to reconcile this. And then we can put Christ like way up here, Justinian here. And so that relationship between the church, the Pope, and God. Christ blessing Otto II and Theophano. That's his wife. Another crucifixion. We start to see that come out as a theme, as a big theme in medieval Europe. And so, let me get this. And let me make sure we're sharing. That's right. That's right. Byzantine carving of the crucifixion. So the next phase of this story of European art is Romanesque period. That's kind of why I was going on through the late medieval, saying they were kind of left on their own devices, they were isolated, not communicating with the rest of the world. But in the late part of the first millennium, they arise, they organize, they fight off the Vikings, they start to organize, they create armies, they establish a relationship with the church. They're not fighting against each other. They seem to be pretty much in sync. And I found this was like this is from a Metropolitan Museum of Art, very I'm trying to find the word. Reliable. Anyway, this is an essay about The expansion of monasticism was the main force behind the unprecedented and cultural, artistic, and cultural activity of the 11th and 12th centuries. So they're moving out of the monasteries. As things kind of get to a place where there's peace, they're organizing, they got the foreigners out, they are expanding, and they're not just in the monasteries. And there's a lot here, and I'll put this on for you guys to read if you want to, but I do want to tell you about the change in the culture. And that is that as we start to get these kings and emperors, people like Charlemagne and Otto I, Otto III, we start to get these, what is the origin of the monarchies that will develop and persist in Europe until the 20th century. So having the Queen Elizabeth II just passed away, all the pomp, all of the ceremony. It's one of the few surviving monarchies, but these monarchies were really pretty much established like 1,000 years ago. Various times, it's not all a big thing, but bottom line is, as they start to settle this out, they start to set some goals for themselves. And one of them is the Crusades that I was just talking about. They said, well, now that we got our act together, we have armies, well-organized armies, we got money, we're wealthy, we have power. Let's go take back Jerusalem. Let's go find all of these artifacts. All of these artifacts that kind of got lost through the centuries. Some of the things that St. Helena did not recover. And so that's kind of what happens. And this is Jerusalem. This is Christian. We're going to go back and take it. And as part of that organization, they really developed kind of a social order. And we have basically the serfs, the peons, the people that work the fields and do the farming and do all of the hard labor. Then you got a military class. People who are soldiers and army, military fighters. And then you move up from that, and then you have the aristocrats. And they start at a very low level, people like dukes and earls and marquises and all of these other low-level monarchs, and they kind of run the country. They become, if you will, like the governors of states. They have their own little areas that they govern, and they report to the emperor. And the emperor's children, the emperor would always try to have as many children as possible. But what they would do is that we would have an eldest male, firstborn, preferably male, like Prince Charles became King Charles, right? They're still doing it. But at any rate, they would have other children, and one of them would be dedicated from the time he was born to be a military leader, a general, if you will. And then other children would be forced or dedicated to the church. And the girls and the boys alike. The women would grow up to be nuns, the boys, priests, and the monks. and so on. So anyway, what you get there is this kind of organization and then we have, it was said, stone churches of hitherto unknown proportions were erected to accommodate ever larger numbers of priests and monks, because that becomes actually quite large. And the growing crowds of pilgrims who came to worship the relics of saints. And so, will it give it to me? We'll leave that. But we have change. Europe is organized. Europe is defending itself. Europe decides they want the Holy Land back. And so, as part of that, they gain prowess in engineering and stuff. And so we start to see this Romanesque time, as a time of prosperity, and they start to invent their own architecture, their own artwork, their own, as I was describing, their own social order, their own society, military, everything. And so with that, I know it's only 4 minutes after 6, but I'm not so sure I want to dive into Romanesque art yet. Any question? Why is a carrot more orange than an orange?
This carrot has that stem, you know.
Yeah.
So that's pretty easy.
I've been searching for the,
On the inside.
I've been searching for the answer all my life. Thank you, Carter. I love it. You guys are smart. So anyway, have a good weekend. I'll see you guys Monday.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too.
I don't know how to do so. No. Like, even at Schnucks, they have like pre-made soups and stuff.
So, you too. And check this out. This is from the year 1000. And what I would say, she dressed in blue, got a halo, and she is enthroned with Christ.
Yeah, I was in Spain and I saw this. They do a lot of stuff like that.
Absolutely.
Was going between my Mac baguette and the cheese one.
Are you sure that she's?
Yeah, but that one was cheaper, so.